Now that you've read Lewis Carroll's Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, we'll talk about some of its major themes and review the different types of nonsense that it presents. Like Shrek's proverbial onion, Alice in Wonderland contains layers. It has messages for adults and for children, can be entertaining to both, and it has themes that are addressed to those two different audiences. There's a political message, for instance, and a lot of people read Alice in Wonderland as a commentary on the War of the Roses, which was a battle between two royal families to determine who should be the King of England. And we see that played out in Alice in Wonderland with the cards who are painting the roses different colors, and of course there's the Queen trying to chop off everybody's heads. There's also a kind of psychedelic reading of Alice in Wonderland dealing with drugs, and the idea that this is all the way in which somebody would describe a really bad trip. After all, she does eat mushrooms and have strange things happen in terms of her perspective. We see a caterpillar who smokes a hookah. So that is another implicit reading available in the text. But we're going to focus on it as a work of children's literature, and so we'll focus mostly on the themes that deal with that genre. So the first one that we want to address is that growing up is hard. And Alice really expresses that, whether it's because she feels uncomfortable with her body and the changes that are happening as she grows up and down, or that she feels like she doesn't fit into her surroundings, both physically and mentally and emotionally in terms of how she can interact with those around her. She just doesn't quite belong. Many people react to Carroll's Alice in Wonderland in much the same way that some of you did to the fairy tales. They find the original text to be strangely disturbing and not at all like the original story they remember from, let's say, the Disney version. Roger Ebert is one such reader, and I'm going to read to you here what he said. Alice's adventures played like a series of encounters with characters whose purpose was to tease, puzzle, and torment her. Few children would want to go to Wonderland, and none would want to stay. The problem may be that I encountered the book too young and was put off by the alarming John Tyndall illustrations. Why did Alice have such deep, dark eye sockets? Why couldn't Wonderland be cozy, like the world of Pooh? This has never been a children's story. There's even a little sadism embedded in Carroll's fantasy. It reminds me of uncles who tickle their nieces until they scream. I wonder how many of you had similar reactions to this. Certainly, we can see a kind of darker side to Wonderland, and we're going to explore some of those elements that make it seem that way. But you might think about, too, how growing up feels to children, and how maybe entering an adult world or an alien world to children feels much like this kind of scary, sadistic world represented here. You may have noticed that the world that Alice enters isn't very fun for her. In fact, she seems to be the only child in this world. There's not a lot of other children or young people that she encounters. Instead, all of the figures that she meets, whether human or animal, take the role of adults who usually yell at her, order her around, lecture her, confuse her, or in the case of the Cheshire Cat, literally look down on her. Alice spends most of her time trying to figure out the rules of this strange world that she's entered, and she's usually frustrated in her attempts. Take this example, but when she was playing croquet. I don't think they play at all fairly, Alice began, in a rather complaining tone, and they all quarrel so dreadfully one can't hear oneself speak, and they don't seem to have any rules in particular, at least if there are, nobody attends to them, and you've no idea how confusing it is. This idea of expecting the world to be fair and thinking that there should be rules that can be adhered to and that the world shouldn't be a confusing place are all things that we usually associate with children, because most of the adults know that rules don't often work out the way they're supposed to, and life usually isn't fair. Alice's adventures in Wonderland often take the form of self-exploration. And several times we hear her asking, "Who am I then?" In this particular case, she goes on, "Tell me that first, and then if I like being that person, I'll come up. If not, I'll stay down here till I'm somebody else." Many of the struggles that she goes through is really her journey in an adult world to try and figure out where she fits in and who she is. And so we hear her asking this question a lot. One thing that you'll want to kind of think more about is what is her answer to that ultimately? Does she discover who she is by the end of the novel? I will invite you to think more about those themes as well as some others in your activities and discussion posts. But for the remainder of this video, I want to talk to you about how the nonsense works in Carroll's text, what different forms he uses to try and kind of create the nonsense that will really appeal to children in particular. Carroll's nonsense takes many forms, and the first we'll address is literary allusions to other patterns of writing. So, epic poetry usually begins with an invocation to a muse for inspiration. Something like in this example that I have here from the Odyssey, "Goddess, daughter of Zeus, sustain me, the song of the various-minded man who, after he had plundered the innermost citadel of hallowed Troy, was made to stand grievously about the coasts of men." Carroll provides a formally similar invocation, but this time from children to the author, and this is one that we talked about in the introductory video, in which the children are basically asking Carroll to tell them a story, and he includes this in the book itself to kind of mimic this sort of epic poetry beginning. Another way in which Carroll alludes to other patterns of writing is by rewriting famous works of children's literature. The excerpt that I have here is from a poem by Robert Southey that children would have been familiar with in much the same way that we are with, say, Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star. "You are old, Father William," the young man cried, "and pleasures with youth pass away. And yet you lament not the days that are gone. Now tell me the reason, I pray." "In the days of my youth," Father William replied, "I remembered that youth could not last. I thought of the future, whatever I did, that I never might grieve for the past." Now you notice that this is kind of a didactic tale, sort of a finger-shaking moral, in which the older curmudgeonly man is saying you should always think of the future so that you won't regret what you're doing in the present. Carroll takes quite a different direction when he rewrites this text. "You are old," said the youth, as I mentioned before, "and have grown most uncommonly fat. Yet you turned a back somersault in at the door. Pray, what is the reason of that?" "In my youth," said the sage as he shook his grey locks, "I kept all my limbs very supple. By the use of this ointment, 1 shilling the box. Allow me to sell you a couple." So we have quite a different kind of text here. It doesn't have the same didactic moral. It's much more humorous. There's physical humor. There's also kind of genre humor with this guy trying to sell this crazy ointment. And so you can tell that he's really taking a different direction, that he doesn't think of these texts as being things that should be didactic, but instead are going more of the entertainment route. Carroll also plays around with the line between image and text, and sort of does something different that make us think about text as working differently. So we see here on this page, the long tail that he creates is actually, and this is some wordplay too, T-A-I-L. And so he creates a visually looking tail on the page that would have really been pretty funny to children, and honestly still is. You'll see that people like Cel Silverstone have really been influenced by that. And this kind of format of poem is sometimes used in sort of imitation of Carroll. Another way in which he plays with the image and the text is the way that he has his illustrations work with the words. So for example, in this image of the mock turtle, the text says, "No," said Alice, "I don't even know what a mock turtle is." "It's the thing from mock turtle soup is made from," said the Queen. "I never saw one or heard of one," said Alice. So you'll notice here that the mock turtle is actually a turtle with a cow's head. That's because mock turtle soup actually has nothing to do with turtles, but is in fact made from cow's head. So he's playing around with this image here, probably mostly for adults too, so that we can, because we'll get the joke about what mock turtle soup is, whereas children might just laugh at the fact that it's kind of two animals shoved together. But either way, fun for everybody. Another thing that this image does actually is that in the text there's a line that says, "If you don't know what a griffin is, look at the picture." Well, so the image to the figure on the left is a griffin. So it's also both teaching, right, having the text refer to the image, but also creating some kind of play there where you have to have one in order to understand the other. Carroll also pushes the limits of narrative and time and space. So for instance, after Alice drinks the bottle that says "drink me," it says she very soon finished it off, and then we see this image of the asterisk. "What a curious feeling," said Alice. "I must be shutting up like a telescope." Well, the way that those asterisks are arranged on the page, it kind of makes us think about liquid going down, and it takes us a little bit of time to sort of imagine that happening. Carol also does some really interesting things with the difference between Alice, the main character, and the narrator, and he switches back and forth several times, and I'll just go through this example that we see here. Down, 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 would the fall never come to an end? I wonder how many miles I've fallen by this time, she said aloud. I must be getting somewhere near the center of the earth. Let me think. That would be 4,000 miles down, I think. For you see, Alice had learned several things of this sort in her lessons in the schoolroom, and though this was not a very good opportunity for showing off her knowledge, as there was no one to listen to her, still it was good to practice to say it over. Yes, that's about the right distance, but then I wonder what latitude or longitude I've got to. Alice had no idea what latitude was, or longitude either, but thought they were nice grand words to say. So you can see here that Carol's using the parentheticals to make kind of a call and response format in which we see that the narrator is viewing the world differently and viewing Alice differently than she is herself, than she's experiencing. One other just interesting little tidbit is that the image that you see here where she's falling down the rabbit hole, actually Tenniel's illustrations didn't show her falling, it just showed the hole itself. So people like Disney have really played on this passage to capture this experience, the time of her falling down the hole. Another device that Carol uses is dramatic irony, which is when the reader knows something that the main character doesn't. Let's look at an example. Presently she began again. I wonder if I shall fall right through the earth. How funny it'll seem to come out among the people that walk with their heads downward. The antipathies, I think. She was rather glad there was no one listening this time, as it didn't sound at all the right word. But I shall have to ask them what the name of the country is, you know. Please, ma'am, is this New Zealand or Australia? And what an ignorant little girl she'll think me for asking. No, it'll never do to ask. Perhaps I shall see it written up somewhere. So we as readers possibly know that antipathies means feelings against, hostile feelings towards, constitutional or settled aversions or dislikes. However, the word that Alice is probably searching for is antipodes, those who dwell directly opposite to each other on the globe so that the soles of their feet are, as it were, planted against each other. So part of the joke here is the assumption that we as readers are going to recognize Alice's mistake. Carol also provides some very full spectrum sensory descriptions, really unusual ones that invite us to think unconventionally. For instance, this bottle was not marked poison, so Alice ventured to taste it, and finding it very nice. It had, in fact, a sort of mixed flavor of cherry tart, custard, pineapple, roast turkey, toffee, and hot buttered toast. She soon finished it off. You may recognize this kind of idea coming up in later literature as well. Roald Dahl, in particular, in the Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, played off of this very idea with his piece of the chewing gum meal. That tiny little strip of gum lying there is a whole 3-course dinner all by itself. This piece happens to be tomato soup, roast beef, and blueberry pie. You can have almost anything you want. And nonsense just isn't nonsense without some ridiculous puns. Towards the beginning of the book, we read this passage. At last the mouse, who seemed to be a person of authority among them, called out, "Sit down, all of you, and listen to me. I'll soon make you dry enough." They all sat down at once in a large ring, with the mouse in the middle. Alice kept her eyes anxiously fixed on it, for she felt sure she would catch a bad cold if she did not get dry very soon. Remember, she's been swimming around in her tears. "Ahem," said the mouse, with an important air. "Are you all ready? This is the driest thing I know. Silence all around, if you please. William the Conqueror, whose cause was favored by the Pope, was soon submitted to by the English, who wanted leaders and had been of late much accustomed to usurpation and conquest," and so on. So a dry story in terms of a boring story, but Carol also plays on that so that Alice is hoping she will get dry. Carol is also quite overt about the fact that he's including a lot of nonsense in this tale. And in fact, we see the word nonsense come up over and over again, both as Alice notices other people's nonsense and as she noticed her own nonsense, much to her chagrin. Finally, Carol really hits home the nonsense in this book by combining it with, well, not nonsense, a lot of sense. So there's a mixture of these morals and ideas that seem quite practical and to make a lot of sense to the reader, along with all of this, what is clearly nonsense. So I encourage you all to think back over some of the many morals embedded in this text that seem true to you or seem like they're not nonsense.